So Andrew, you work with people that are victims of domestic abuse. How would you make the distinction between normal behavior in a relationship and that sliding over into coercive control or domestic abuse?
Well, I think you nailed it, actually, in really, really resonating in what you're saying, in that it depends on how the person feels and whether, for me, it's because, so I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine was in a relationship long term with a female. They had 2 children together. They were equally nasty to each other. They were both physically violent towards each other. It's hard to say who was the aggressor and who was the victim. It was just a dysfunctional relationship, in my opinion. And so for me, it's where one side is definitely getting bullied to the point where one side definitely sort of has the upper hand over the decisions being made, over the direction of the relationship, over what happens. And to me, that's then where it perhaps tips over into abusive, where you've got both sides being equally nasty, which like as I have seen with a good friend of mine. For me, that's a dysfunctional relationship. That I'm not saying it's a healthy relationship, although they were both together for a long time, and yeah, it's not a relationship that I would want. So I think it is down to an individual. We don't do enough work at school with kids around boundaries. What does that even look like in a relationship? What are your boundaries? How are you going to communicate them? And so, yeah, I think it's about how you feel. And frankly, a couple of the guys that have contacted me reporting domestic abuse, when they themselves have then described what's going on, because obviously we're unpacking it a bit, I'm like, really? Actually, I've got concerns about your behavior. So I think it depends on like you say, on how the individual feels. And there are plenty of relationships where it's half a dozen of one, 6 of the other, whatever the phrase is.
There is this behavior of passive aggressiveness, obviously. And I have experienced that a couple of times where, and that was in friendships and relationships that I had, where women would put themselves into a victim position, which made me feel horrible because I actually hadn't done anything. And I felt attacked because they changed the power dynamics. They put themselves underneath me, but by doing that, they actually exerted power over me. And these situations are quite common, as far as I know, where there is a disconnect in communication, and both sides fail to communicate how they feel about a certain situation. So, for example, the woman says, "You made me feel uncomfortable," and then you say, "Oh, I was just being myself," and then you are actually attacked for being yourself. So you have 2 victims and 2 people that did something. And unfortunately, nowadays, everything is seen as intentional abuse, where it's often miscommunication. And I think there should be a stronger focus on relationship therapy. But this relationship therapy needs to understand male and female dynamics. And I think nowadays it's very targeted towards the female dynamic without actually understanding how men feel. And when you said there should be more education in school, and I completely agree with that, there is some education, but it only talks about consent of women, not consent of men. Respect women, not respect each other. And there are actually domestic abuse trainings from domestic abuse organizations that go into schools and say, boys, now we have to sit down and learn how you can respect women. And the women's session is, girls, now we have to teach you how to be empowered and fight for yourself. Complete disconnect, where it should be the same training for both of them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Training girls and boys to respect each other, to work out what their own boundaries might even look like. You see, I honestly believe, for me, one of the reasons I fell into an abusive relationship, my ex-wife, she didn't change. She didn't trick me or con me, you know, made me fall in love with her and then she changed later down the line. You know, she was at the beginning, as she was throughout, an absolute, it was just a nightmare from the start. But I was a nice guy. I didn't have any clear boundaries. I liked helping people and making people better. And then because I didn't have any boundaries, there was just no exit. I just fell deeper and deeper and then couldn't get out. And so I think really trying to work with girls and boys equally, I think it would be great if in the domestic abuse organisations that go into schools, that there are men and women going into the schools rather than it just being sort of a female-led education thing. And so, yeah, there's a lot to do.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about your new project.
Yeah, so I was contacted actually by they're a domestic abuse project, and their main remit is actually supporting families where the child is abusing the parent, which again is increasingly common but not really talked about very much. You know, even a good friend of mine, she's a single mum and she was knocked about by her teenage daughters. But you know, how do you speak out about that? Because if you do, you're gonna be fearful that people will think you're a rubbish parent, that you've allowed that to happen. And so that's their main remit. But they got in contact with me following the TEDx talk because they got some funding to deliver a project for male victims of domestic abuse, but they needed it to be a dad who's been through it themselves to sort of co-lead with them. So it's been difficult in lockdown trying to get engagement. We were going to launch like this kind of face-to-face service, but just as we were about to launch it, then lockdown happened. And so we instead launched a Facebook group that's begun to gather momentum now. We've begun to make connections with the police to get referrals through. But it has been hard engaging men in that it feels like men will join the Facebook group because possibly they're experiencing that, but actually getting them out to talk about it that is a challenge, definitely.
Can I just weigh in and say that Elizabeth connection died and she's really sorry, but she can't be here for the rest of the conversation.
Yep. Okay, thanks for that.
Why do you think it is that men fail to engage in real life, so to speak?
Well, I think with domestic abuse, this is my gut feel. It's not a research-backed argument, but from a gut feel, I think we're still in the early stages of men speaking out. I think it's moving in the right direction with sort of mental health awareness of men being victims of domestic abuse. But I think men are still very nervous of speaking out, that they're going to get judged, that they're going to look weak in some way. Generally, when men do contact me, it's generally because they're caught up in family court chaos. So they've been the victim of domestic abuse and they want some kind of advice. They want hope because it's just such a nightmare. They're spending so much money. They're not seeing their kids. So normally they're at absolutely breaking point due to family court chaos. Whereas I think if they're sort of experiencing domestic abuse, they're perhaps a bit more tentative in reaching out. Is this actually abuse? Or, you know, she only hit me a couple of times. Maybe I'm overreacting, that kind of stuff. I guess they're plugging into the group to see what people are saying to measure up, well, am I truly in an abusive relationship or am I in a difficult relationship? And again, there are differences and it depends on, I guess, how the person feels.
So could you tell me the name of the domestic abuse Facebook group?
Sure, it's Phoenix Against Domestic Abuse for Dads. And that's the project in Hertfordshire that I'm involved in and been sort of trying to get off the ground. And we're just moving, well, we were just moving, although obviously lockdown, we've got new restriction measures now in Birmingham, is again putting it on hold. We were just moving to delivering face-to-face meetings. We had our first one scheduled for the end of September, but that's being put back now. But that's the funded service in Hertfordshire, and it has funding to support men in Hertfordshire. And then my own page is called Men's Space, which is just an online support. At the moment, I don't have plans for face-to-face meetings, but that depends on where we're at in 3 to 4 months' time.
Okay. Kat, do you have a question?
Not so much a question, just in the sense that I was going to say that I'm absolutely fascinated by this idea that you're saying, you know, you had to set up help for parents who are being abused by their teenage children. You know, that didn't ever occur to me. You know, as somebody who spends a lot of time fighting for unrecognized victims, it's rather surprising to me that that one never occurred. That was a whole unrecognized area. And even when you said it, as I'm sure some people in the audience would have felt as well, even when you said it, that, you know, the first thing that popped into my head was, well, that sounds ridiculous. You know, like, clearly these parents are just not able to keep control over their children. And I don't mean that was the reaction that I went with. Simply that it's really fascinating when you're able to get a little glimpse into the other side, what it's like to be ignorant of these types of things. The way that so many people are ignorant of the difficulty that men go through, and so many people would say, well, that's ridiculous. If they're a big, strong man, why can't they defend themselves? So I am just, I wanted to pass on that I think it's incredible that you are doing that work. I think that far more knowledge needs to be made aware of that, because I don't think anybody's aware of that. You know, our side certainly don't talk about it.
It's definitely increased during lockdown. It's not actually, that part of work isn't my own. Just, I would say, I partnered with that group that delivers that work because they've got funding to deliver support specifically for dads. But yeah, I mean, if you look in the press, actually, there are a few articles where the reports of parents being abused by their children has gone up by quite some way under lockdown, as I'm sure. I mean, that's fairly obvious that it would. And I mean, I'm a dad to 2 teenage girls because I won custody of my daughters eventually. And it's really not easy being a parent to teenagers. It's a hugely challenging time. And when you add in phones and social media and Snapchat, when you add in boundaries and teenagers obviously trying to push every possible boundary, and you're trying to push back a little, it really is a big problem. And I think it's not. I think the other thing we need to remember, and we've talked quite a bit about relationships, with the individualistic culture that we have, consumer-based culture, we have become more self-centered and selfish in general. I know that's a huge generalization, but when you consider that, and then you consider teenagers under lockdown, it's not surprising that parents being abused by kids is hugely increased, and that the perpetrators will be daughters and sons. Let's not imagine it's just single mums being knocked about by their teenage sons, and the victims will sometimes be the dads being knocked about by their daughters.
Would you say that there is a fear of parents of actually having authority because that could be misinterpreted as being abusive parents?
I think it's partly that. Where I've seen it, I think parents are nervous that, you know, teenagers are so empowered and so savvy today for the most part, and parents fear putting their foot down. Teenager will just be out the door. See you later. I'll come back in a few days. And because of social media, because they've got all these networks of content. You know, when I was a boy, we had one landline phone in the house. That was it. So they've got all these ways of connecting. So probably most teenagers probably could go and stay somewhere for a couple of days and see you later. And so it is very difficult parenting. I think a lot of people really fear putting their foot down on boundaries and then putting up with the kickback that they're going to get. When you then add in that a lot of, in families where both parents are actually working as well, so the teenager's often at home quite a lot, going to school on their own, you know, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, and there's definitely fear. But also we live with the snowflake generation where we've given them everything they've ever wanted. Yeah. Phones, so much freedom.
Without responsibility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are kids with phones as young as 8 or 9. I mean, that is ludicrous, but you see it all the time.